Thanks for clicking. Canada's inflation rate for the month of October came in at 6.9% today, beating many expectations that we would be seeing a 7+% inflation rate. The news comes one day after CIBC's Benjamin Tal said that Canada would be experiencing a 7+% inflation rate for the next few months, as gas, food, and shelter costs put upward pressure on the overall price of goods.
You think?
And I think this point is well taken, or should be, that the inflation rate, while on a downward trajectory, could remain sticky for a long time. So what I want to do today is go over Canada's inflation rate, take a look at how long it has taken the CPI to come down during previous bouts of inflation, look at some other pressures pushing the price of goods up, and then discuss what to look for next. Speaking of next, we will be having our monthly mortgage rate update on this channel next week. If you want to get those updates, make sure you click like and subscribe. But for now, let's get into this inflation rate. As mentioned, Canada's inflation rate came in at 6.9% for the month of October, halting the downward trajectory that we've seen over the past few months. If we take out food and energy, prices rose 5.3%, 0.1% less than the 5.4% they rose in September. The bad news, however, is that CPI core inflation increased, with CPI trim and CPI median increasing by 0.1%. Not much, given that Bank of Canada Governor Tiff Macklem said the bank is going to be focusing more on core inflation when it's deciding its path of interest rate hikes. If we're expecting interest rates to go down eventually, this is definitely not the direction we wanted to see.
I need that money, that's all we got!
But how long can this higher cost of goods stick around? Let's take a brief look at the 1980s, the last time inflation was this high. Back in the 1980s, there were some differences than there are now, mainly debt levels and China, but we had an inflation rate at 12.5% in 1981, which came down fairly quickly due to ultra-high interest rates, and came down to 4.3% 3 years later. But then, and this is the important part, it just stayed around 4% for 6 years. Throughout this period, the Bank of Canada fiddled with prime, raising it up and down to one extreme or another, while inflation remained sticky at 4%. So despite a massive effort on the central bank in the 1980s to get that inflation rate down to 2%, it proved very sticky and stuck around for over 5 years. And then bumped up again and then went way down, but that's besides the point. So after a massive effort to get the inflation rate under control at the beginning of the 1980s, inflation stuck around for quite a few years, in and around that 4% level. Fast forward to 2022, and there are some real ongoing pressures which are unlikely to let up. In his interview, Benjamin Tal mentioned gas, food, and shelter as reasons the inflation rate would remain high for the next few months.
Gasoline prices will be the number one factor. Food prices will be another one. If you look at the housing market, there is a delay there. Rent is rising very strongly, so you will see it more than falling house prices because there is a delay there. So I see actually the shelter component actually being more inflationary.
And there's a lot of pressure on these three measures of inflation, food, gas, and shelter, pressures which are likely to remain around for some time. Perhaps the most pressure is currently on the gas prices. For gas, OPEC just recently slashed production, which is likely to put even more pressure on our gas prices for the foreseeable future. And it's not only OPEC putting pressure on our gas prices. For the past few months, the prices that we've seen at the pump, the prices that we think are way too high, have been artificially subsidized by the United States, depleting its strategic petroleum reserve ahead of the midterm elections. And now that the midterms are over, many are predicting that the US will halt the release of those reserves, which will decrease the amount of supply going onto the market. A decrease in supply followed by maybe static demand equals an increase in prices. So even if the US doesn't stop the release of the CPR right away, they will eventually. It has to eventually. It can't subsidize global oil consumption in perpetuity.
Be my friend.
So we have OPEC cutting production, we have the US very soon set to halt the release of its SPR, and that's not even to mention the unpredictable war with Russia and Ukraine, and not to mention China's oil demand starting to surge again. All of these pressures show a gas portion of our inflation rate, which is unlikely to get better anytime soon. Then we have food prices, which don't really respond to interest rate hikes. They're inelastic. Most economists are predicting that food prices won't be going down anytime soon either. Though food prices did decelerate to a 10.1% year-over-year growth, down 0.2% from September's 10.3%. Food prices rose at a 41-year high rate in September, and with the ongoing war in Ukraine, show very few signs of slowing. And with diesel prices going sky high as well, those prices will bleed into food prices. And finally, shelter, which we spoke about in a recent video. Rents were up 15% as of September. despite the continual fall in our real estate prices, all of which make up about 50% of the CPI basket, all showing very few signs of slowing down within the next few months. And that's not even to mention wage inflation. With more and more strikes being seen throughout the country, we're going to be seeing more and more upward pressure put on wages, something Governor Macklem warned about in the summer of this year.
Who the do you think you are, you crazy little
And yeah, people lose 10% of their purchasing power, they want it back. And I think there's a real sense, a real hope out there that Canada's inflation rate continues its downward trajectory, gets down to 1.5%, 2%, the Bank of Canada turns the taps back on, and we're back off to the races.
And it goes. The park is open 24/7, 365.
But historically, that's just not the case. So while October's inflation rate didn't come in at that 7+% that many were expecting, we certainly halted our downward trajectory, the downward trajectory we've been seeing over the past few months. And the core inflation rate, the inflation rate that the Bank of Canada is going to be focusing on when it makes its rate hikes, actually accelerated after stagnating for the past few months. While many are hoping that we'll be back down to that 2% CPI in just a matter of months, maybe even a year, history tells us that that's just not. That inflation can remain sticky for a long time. And if we look at the CPI basket and what is forcing that inflation rate up, if we look at gas, food, and shelter, they show signs of acceleration over the past few months. With that said, we'll continue to monitor Canada's inflation rate and the bank's responses to that inflation rate on this channel. Click like and subscribe if you want to get those updates, but for now, thanks so much for watching.